Thank you.
Absolutely delighted to be here and to have a conversation with Joan, who I've known for 30 years. But my most important credential was unfortunately left out. We've been coming to Chilmark since 1959. And we stayed for the first 20 years at the parsonage. We rented it along with another family. It had no running water for the first 10 years, so the community center was very valuable to us back then. Joan, I've known for a long time. I'm a huge fan of hers. She's been a leading Supreme Court reporter for 30 years. She was at Reuters, Washington Post, USA Today. She's now the chief legal correspondent, really, for the Supreme Court for CNN, which people probably have seen Joan in many capacities. She's on a lot of shows, Face the Nation, the rest. Whenever there's a major happening in the Supreme Court, everyone knows to go to Joan Biskupic. She's written, in addition to the book we're talking about today, Nine Black Robes, she wrote a fabulous biography of Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, of Antonin Scalia, of Sonia Sotomayor, and the Chief Justice John Roberts. That's hard to do on top of a full-time job. She is also one of 9 children, which I always thought gave her a special insight to the workings of the court.
The oldest.
No surprise there. So here's the opening question. Why this book? Why now? Why did you decide to even write this book?
Thanks, Richard. And it is great to be with you. And we've been told that we want to make sure everybody hears this panel, and so we're going to speak right directly to you. So raise your hand in the back if you can't suddenly hear, because we want to make sure you capture everything. This one was a departure from my usual MO of focusing on a single justice and trying to understand his or her life and contribution to the law, and how much of the contribution arose from, heritage, legacy, just, how much was personal identity and how much was experience. But this group portrait arose in part because I was noticing the Trump effect on the court. After I finished the chief in 2019, and I was thinking about, which justice might be my next subject, no one seemed right, because you want someone who's already got a record that you can see, and you also want someone who has a good personal history that speaks to readers. I've been fascinated by certain justices over the years, including Justice John Paul Stevens, whose papers have now become available, but you have to think about whether, is this someone that people will want to read a full 400-page book about? But as I was thinking about an individual, what got me interested in this group portrait was just how I was noticing internal maneuverings among the justices to counter the Trump effect. I knew that Chief Justice John Roberts, a conservative, a Republican appointee of George W. Bush, had begun to bristle at some of the Trump positions. With each Trump nominee, I was noticing a different dynamic with the court. It's a very cliche phrase that with each new justice, you get a new Supreme Court. And I thought, Richard, that it would be important to capture that. But I have to tell you that when I sold this book proposal in early 2020, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was alive. We had not yet really experienced COVID. So much was different. And I thought what I'd be telling was a very interior story, not ever suspecting that we would have this huge, momentous event of the reversal of Roe v. Wade. And my manuscript was initially due at the late 2021, early 2022. But once the Supreme Court agreed to hear the Dobbs decision, I said, I cannot finish this book until we have that in hand, because that will be the spine of this book. And indeed, as you know, Richard, it opens with the maneuverings behind the scenes with the 2 abortion cases, one from Texas on SB 8, and then the Mississippi Dobbs case, and kind of what will then happen to the court and happen to the law.
Right. So what would you think are the most important takeaways from someone who's read your book? And actually, one thing remarkable about the book, which I just want to throw in there, is people talk to Joan the way people don't talk at the Supreme Court. I mean, the Supreme Court is notoriously cloistered. They speak one way, their opinions. Sometimes they give speeches, but they don't talk to reporters. The clerks don't talk to reporters. The justices don't talk to reporters. But from your book, they talk to you, because your book is really riddled with example after example where you say, I later learned that this justice negotiated that, this justice changed the position on that. So I want to talk about that at some point, but what are your most important takeaways?
Okay, first of all, just how they get to certain decisions. I was able to see certain switched votes at various times. As Richard knows, one of the things I brought to my book on the chief was 2 switched votes in the Obamacare case. In this one, I was able to see when in 2018-19, he switched votes in the Wilbur Ross case. That's the census question case. But the one that I think, the issues that I think I really tried to illuminate the most were reproductive rights, how in the beginning you see that the liberals and even the chief are kind of hopeful about what Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Brett Kavanaugh will do. They're misled at various points about where their votes are going to be on this. And in the end, they feel a little bit, misled, schnookered in some ways about how they're going to vote. So I feel like you get to see what leads to the decision, what kind of maneuverings. And I have to say, one thing that I learned in the end was that once that draft opinion came out on May 2nd, 2022,
the Dom's opinion.
yes, the Chief Justice continued very hard to try to get to some sort of compromise position that would allow the Mississippi ban on 15 weeks of pregnancy for abortion, but not go all the way. But that once that leak came out, his hands were really tied. He kept trying and trying and trying, but there was really no entree for him just because of what had become public. And what I usually do is I do a lot of reporting behind the scenes when decisions are being discussed, but I never write about what I've learned until the end, because I know things can change. As Ruth Bader Ginsburg once said, and quoting Yogi Berra, the great judicial scholar, it ain't over till it's over. And because that's true. Sometimes in late June, decisions get rewritten, votes change. It's not often, but it's often enough that it changes the course of the law that affects all of you.
Now, was that also the most surprising thing you learned, or is there anything? You've covered the court for a long time, but I think the access you have now to the justices is an order of magnitude greater than it was for the first 25 plus years.
Yeah, and I also realized I had access to the justices. My first biography was of Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, and that book came out in 2005. And I had, I'll mention some things I learned, Justice Scalia spoke on the record. Justice Thomas spoke on the record. They used to speak on the record much more. They still speak to me, but they used to speak on the record, in part, I think, because, Richard, my topics were a little softer, so to speak. The Justice O'Connor's record was essentially finished when I was doing her. Justice Scalia's wasn't, even though, it turned out he only had about 5 more years to live after my 2009 biography. But I was getting more material that gave me insights into the court that I started to learn how to use better. People would tell me things, but I wove them into the tale. But what I started to do, starting with a scoop I got when I did the Sonia Sotomayor political history about how she had really, she was the one who got the justices to switch their vote on the initial Abigail Fisher affirmative action case, where they essentially saved affirmative action first in 2013, then in 2016. But I learned how to use that information a little bit more to tell all of you, look, what you're seeing isn't always what you get. And you look at how close something came, or look at how fortunes were changed, and more importantly, who changed those fortunes. And for example, I saw, 2 people who really worked in concert with the chief, Stephen Breyer, who left the court in 2022, of course, but also Elena Kagan. I could see how, when they were able to reach some consensus, who were the forces behind that, and who were the forces really fighting that consensus?
Right. So, as we heard from the last panel, Donald Trump ran on this, right? Donald Trump, in unprecedented fashion, basically said, I know some of you don't like me, but here's my list. He expressly said, here's my list of people I put on the Supreme Court. So even if you don't like me, you should vote for me because I'm going to put these people on the court. They're going to overrule Roe v. Wade. I mean, no one had ever been this explicit before. And he had a list. So did he succeed? He got elected and got the justices on.
Most definitely. And one of my chapters in the book, most of the book is, as I said, kind of the interior of the Supreme Court, what your Supreme Court has done. But there's a chapter called The Triumvirate, where I really get underneath the workings of Leonard Leo, the workings of Mitch McConnell, and the workings of Don McGahn, who was White House counsel and was the man who, a lot of people here will remember where they were in February, Valentine's Day weekend of 2016, when Justice Scalia died. And that's when, we all thought the court was going to flip because, of course, it would be the first time that President Obama would be able to replace a conservative justice with a liberal justice. And, we all know how that played out. But there was that moment Mitch McConnell, Leonard Leo, and Don McGahn were ready for. What I found out was they had already discussed what happens. This was, like in 2015. They had discussed what happens if someone dies or retires. And, of course, they were thinking more about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was 3 years older than Antonin Scalia. Scalia looked very vigorous, even though he was 79 and actually, had some ill health. But so when Leonard Leo gets word from one of the Scalia children that the justice has died, he immediately gets in touch with Mitch McConnell's people and Don McGahn. And they all decide, and you know what was going on that night? As I'm sure many of you actually will now recollect, it was one of the first Republican debates. It was a Republican debate in South Carolina. So on stage was Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, John Kasich, all of them, cast of thousands at that point. And what they decided collectively was Mitch McConnell decided at that moment, he was in the Virgin Islands, the Senate was in recess, and he later said, thank God the Senate was in recess because I was able to unilaterally decide we ain't going to hear from anybody who President Obama puts up with. Puts up to succeed Justice Scalia. And what Leonard Leo and Don McGahn and Mitch McConnell decided, the message is going to be delay, delay, delay. And they gave Trump, Don McGahn called Donald Trump and said, this is what you do. I've got a couple names for you to mention. Diane Sykes, the Seventh Circuit appellate judge, and Judge Pryor down in the 11th. I'm going to, mention their names, say that these are the kind of people we would name if you become president, but the message is delay, delay, delay. And if you look at the transcript from that night, it's delay, delay, delay. And with the simultaneous message, if you elect me, I will make sure I appoint justices who oppose Roe v. Wade, and indeed, all three of them did.
And it would have been a seismic shift. I mean, if Obama had gotten that appointment,
right,
the court would have been majority progressive for the first time since January 1971. I mean, Richard Nixon put on 4 justices, including the Chief Justice, in 4 years, his first term. That's when the court switched from progressive to conservative. It had been that way ever since. So we're talking almost 50 years. So it had been a huge, huge shift in the court with Garland coming on. It would have had 5 votes, reliably progressive at that point. So here's just, this is outside your area. I'm just curious when you were talking. So let's say the tables have been turned. Let's say the court had been reliably liberal since January 1971, and the liberal icon had died then, and there was a Republican president. Do you think Chuck Schumer would have let that Republican president appoint someone that last year and held a hearing, or would he have also done delay?
No. I think, okay, I'm not going to play Chuck Schumer's hand fully here, but the way the Democrats had been acting to that point with a full year, I don't think they would have blocked it. I mean, it wasn't their MO. Whereas, as I said, this was a concerted effort on the part of Mitch McConnell and Don McGahn and Leonard Leo that had been in the works. And let me tell you one other thing that you all should know. In 2009, when Barack Obama took office, again, this kind of a triumvirate, at least with two of them, and then like Don McGahn being represented by other members of the Federalist Society, got together and said, we got to send a letter to Barack Obama saying that we are going to be, even though we're in the minority, because remember they were at that time, we are going to scrutinize all of your appointees. We are going to be so tough on them, and you're going to have consultation. And they were, for their lower court hearings. You might remember that in 2013, the reason then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid dropped the filibuster for lower court judges was because Mitch McConnell was so effectively blocking D.C. Circuit nominees and others. So they had already, starting in, the point I make in my book is that starting in 2009 with Barack Obama's presidency and two-term presidency, the Republicans, these core right-wing Republicans, had put Obama on notice of their tactics. You know, we didn't see all of them, but when I go back and trace them in my book, they were playing such super hardball, and they were united. See, the other thing about Democrats is, as you know, there can be, you know, like such, you know, you don't have the cohesion, let's just put it that way, that would allow kind of a game plan to play out.
And so do you think, since Trump was successful, Democratic presidential candidates in the future should do the same game plan? Well,
first of all, I think that, you know, let's just take a look at what President Biden did with Ketanji Brown Jackson. He went with someone who was seen very much as a liberal. She's certainly a history-making justice, as our first African-American woman, but she didn't have a reputation as being middle of the road. As, for example, another woman who was in contention was Leandra Kruger, who's out on the California Supreme Court, whose reputation was a little bit more as someone who certainly would have been a liberal, but might have had a little bit more give and take. And so I think somebody like Justice Jackson was at least embodied the liberal ideal the way the conservatives were always looking for the conservative ideal.
So you know the justices better than most anyone. You go to the courtroom all the time. You watch the cases. You watch their votes. You watch and listen to the oral arguments. And I think a lot of people don't really know them. They think of them as blocks. So let me just ask you about some of them and give us your impressions of them.
Okay.
Justice Barrett. It's like a lightning rod round, right?
Okay.
Justice Barrett.
Okay, well, just so you know, he just told me he was going to do this earlier. So, you know, I'm going to give you a lot of different threads. Some will be important, some will be color, whatever. We'll just do it as Richard suggests, as, you know, kind of a lightning rod. Okay, Amy Coney Barrett, mother of 7 children. She talks about always being used to working with a group of 9. 2 of her children were adopted from Haiti. She's, you know, quite interesting. She comes from a very, very religious background. You all learned about People of Praise, which made up of Catholics, but people who are a little bit more evangelical Catholic, that she was raised in that that kind of atmosphere. She ends up, she was raised in New Orleans. Father was a energy company executive. She then goes to Notre Dame for law school. She's tapped, and you know, look at the kind of people who end up on the Supreme Court. You usually don't end up with Notre Dame Law School graduates, but she ended up getting funneled from Notre Dame to Larry Silberman on the D.C. Circuit, to Justice Scalia, who really likes her. And, you know, she's kind of, you know, becomes part of the great Federalist Society judge appointing machine. She's someone, here's the substantive part that you should know about her. Well, okay, 2 things. She is, like many of the justices, writing a book. She's gotten a multi-million-dollar book contract. She does not have the kind of personal story that Justice Sotomayor, Justice Thomas, even Justice Jackson, who's also gotten a multi-million-dollar book contract to do. So I'm just really curious what she is going to say in that book and what kind of readership it will have. The other thing you should know about her is that she is the one who went right after being appointed and taking her seat and, you know, serving for a few months, went to the McConnell Center and said, one thing I'm here to convince you about is we're not partisan hacks, which did not land very well because it showed no real sense of kind of what self-awareness in some ways. But I do know that she is trying, in her opinions, to say, I'm not quite with them, that she doesn't want to appear to be just knee-jerk right-wing. And during her questions from the bench and some of her opinions show her at least trying to take a more thoughtful, not automatic, originalist in the very right-wing way approach. but her votes are solidly with them in most cases. There was one exception with the independent state legislature.
Right. But in terms of quality of her questions, she a good questioner?
Exactly.
Is she a good writer?
She is. She's very thoughtful in her questions. She's very thoughtful in her writing. No one would ever say that she's phoning it in any way. It's just that what is she doing in her bottom line vote for the country? I think she's the kind of person who gives, like Justice Kagan and Chief Justice John Roberts, some, optimism that maybe she will edge over to the left. The question is, will she really when it matters?
Right. All right. Brand new justice.
Okay.
First impressions. First year has just been completed. Justice Jackson.
Okay. The word that some of her friends use on her is she is intentional. She is very intentional about what she's doing. She decided who she wanted to. She got photographed for Vogue early on, and she had this law clerk write the copy for it. She's very aware of her image and what she will do, where she will speak. She also has gotten a very fancy book contract. It was negotiated by the people who did, Barack and Michelle Obama's book contracts. It might come out as early as 24. I don't see why they would want to bring the book out in an election year cycle, but, I would look for that. She was born in D.C., grew up in Miami. She's someone who herself comes from, as I said, what an interesting background, the first African-American justice. She has an interesting family in that she's talked about obviously being, way back when in her life, obviously a descendant of slaves, where she married a man she met at Harvard who's a Boston Brahmin. So, she's got an interesting story to tell. And talk about questions from the bench. She has exceeded the other justices in terms of how active she has been on the bench, not just as a first-year justice, but as someone who just in competition with the others. And, I have to say, sitting in that courtroom, I will sometimes see some eye rolling. I can see that some of the other justices are like, let's get on with it. But she's like, no, I'm not going to play the freshman role here. Neil Gorsuch didn't do it either. And so she's been lauded in many ways for how much her voice is being heard. And it was stunning to see her so active in the voting rights case and so active in the Harvard. Actually, she didn't sit through the Harvard case because she had been part of the Board of Overseers, but she sat through the University of North Carolina affirmative action case, very active in that. And then to see her when the Chief Justice announced the opinion and Justice Clarence Thomas really went after her in the concurrence that he spoke from the bench. She's looking straight out, trying not to betray any emotion, but how compelling it was to see her in that moment, knowing that Justice Thomas has taken this rare opportunity to say exactly how he feels about this ruling and how he feels about her. And he really unspooled that in the written opinion. And she really had at it back at him in her written.
Yeah, she certainly made it clear that she was not going to be a shrinking violet her first year.
That's right.
At oral argument, she spoke an average of 1,628 words per oral argument. The next closest was less than 600.
Yeah. So you will hear from her plenty.
Right. By the way, on the book contract issue, it's interesting. It's not happenstance they write books. The justice salary is what, about $250?
It's closer to $300,000.
Almost $300,000 a year. That's not bad in some ways, but not a lot for a Supreme Court justice. They can make $30,000 addition by teaching a year. That's it. It's capped, but unlimited royalties. So the one way they can make money is by writing books. So that's why you see them write books. All right, Justice Gorsuch.
Okay. Justice Gorsuch, I hope that if you do read my book, you read about Justice Gorsuch's mother. I have this thing. I mean, and many of you might remember Anne Gorsuch Burford. Her name changed in the press while she was EPA administrator. She was Ronald Reagan's EPA administrator, and she was such a lightning rod against regulation that she even ticked off the Reagan administration. They essentially ran her out of town. And as they ran her out of town, Neil Gorsuch was in high school at Georgetown Prep. And she writes in her book, which is wonderfully entitled, Are You Tough Enough? And, so here she is raising this son, and he's saying to her, you shouldn't quit, you didn't do anything wrong. And she writes how personally he took it. And, as she was being run out of town, John Roberts, who went on to be Chief Justice, is in the Reagan administration, and he was too junior to have really a hand in what was happening to her. But Ted Olson, whose name you might be familiar with from various things, certainly did. And in her book, she denigrates Ted Olson as Teddy Olson throughout the whole thing. But I think Neil Gorsuch has that kind of, a little bit of I'll show them. He definitely did not want to conform to the decorum at the court. He immediately got into conflicts with Chief Justice John Roberts. And as I was mentioning to Richard today, I really tracked a lot of the headbutting that Neil Gorsuch precipitated among many of his colleagues, and wrote about it early on in 2017. And a lot of friends of Neil Gorsuch said, oh, don't worry, he'll grow on them, he'll be fine. Well, no, they're still, and in fact, one of his fellow conservatives, Samuel Alito, in the interview he did recently with the Wall Street Journal, even had enough implicit complaints about Sam Alito that the Wall Street Journal referred to him as ornery. So he's someone who is going to be his own person. He has a very distinctive record, unlike any other justice on the right or the left, on Native American rights. So, he is really carving out something there. He will occasionally move over to the left side or center on some criminal defense issues, but he's basically going to do what he wants to do and not be concerned about trying to hold the court together at the center.
Yeah, very pompous, very imperious, and not that popular,
not popular
with anyone, but very popular with the tribes. He has become quite a striking champion of the Native American tribes in case after case. Last justice for the lightning rod, you mentioned a moment ago, Sam Alito, right, who's been on the court for a while. I think most people would never have heard of him until recently. He's sort of the Zeppo Marx of the Marx brothers.
Well, that's right, Richard. And he almost didn't get on the court. He was a little bit of a, he was like a third choice because, you remember back in 2005 for the Sandra Day O'Connor seat, which Sam Alito eventually got, the first choice of W. Bush was John Roberts, because at that point, Chief Justice Bill Rehnquist had not died. So first, George W. Bush has chosen John Roberts. Then when the old chief dies on September 3rd of 2005, the administration decides, look, the reception for John Roberts has been so wonderful. He's handled himself so well with senators. We will make him Chief Justice, even though he was only 50 at the time. And we will put a woman in Sandra Day O'Connor's seat now, and we chose Harriet Miers. Remember her? Well, what happened to Harriet Miers is that the right wing rose up. Judge Bork, former Judge Bork, was alive at the time, and he said on, the radio and TV, she's a disaster in every way. She, in some ways it was kind of a snobby thing. She had gone to SMU for law school. She had been in the White House counsel's office. She had served George W. Bush from Texas, but she was not someone who you would ever thought was an intellectual thinker. She had done fine in the kind of litigation she had done in Texas, but again, the liberals were not against her. They're like, well, it is the W. Bush administration, and actually maybe if she's not a big heavyweight, that's better for our side. But the right wing was like, no, she is not going to go. And they so pressured the Bush administration that she dropped out. And it was a little bit of a sop to Harriet Miers that Alito got chosen, because her first choice in the 2005 sweepstakes had always been Sam Alito, and that's who got it, over Michael Ludig and Judge Wilkinson from the Fourth Circuit.
And what about as a justice now, Alito? I mean, Alito really is he's really out there. I mean, more than
Completely.
anyone else on the conservative
Completely,
side.
and he wasn't like that. He was kind of shy. I remember I talked to him a lot at the beginning, and he was not someone who asked a lot of questions in the beginning. He told me he wanted to defer to other justices who were more senior than him. He had a little bit of trouble bopping his head on the microphone sometimes. I mean, he was, he was mostly like this guy who seemed, super smart. I mean, he had been on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, but, a little awkward, did not, the one time that he really went viral, or the first time he went viral, was after the Citizens United case in 2010, when Barack Obama said, all the wrongs it would do, and Sam Alito mouths "not true," and that goes viral. So he was kind of an awkward guy, and he also, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was one time reading a dissent from the bench, he was like and it was almost like, for those of you who remember the old SNL thing between like Chevy Chase and Jane Curtin, like but he couldn't help himself. And, those of us in the courtroom, it's not being televised like the State of the Union was, are like, oh my God. And she later said, well, at least I'm in good company. He did it with the president. But so he was like this, he was somebody who was, writing, decisions that were pretty hard right conservative, but he was not out there as a firebrand, a real firebrand. But in time, he has gotten that way. He's gotten crankier. He has used the Wall Street Journal most recently, as Richard suggested, to talk to the editorial page, to try to build support for his positions and to criticize his colleagues, which is surprising.
Well, and that speech he gave in Rome last.
Oh, yeah. What Richard is referring to, it's right after the Dobbs ruling reversing Roe v. Wade, and there he is on the dime of a Notre Dame Religious Liberty Institute, speaking to a bunch of their members in Notre Dame, and he's mocking critics of it. He's talking about how, it drew even, he's saying, the name that cannot be said, and he talked about how foreign leaders even criticized him, and it was surprising how mocking he would be so soon after the Dobbs decision. But look at what he did in that. Look at what he pulled off. He got that majority. Obviously, the chief tried to pick off votes, and he wrote that with such force and such language that, I wouldn't have expected him, Richard, to write even 10 years earlier. I mean, he would have voted against Roe, but to write it as he did was so stunning.
So you've followed the court and covered them for 3 decades. How has the court changed? I mean, you start, 1993? Is that when you began?
I actually began, I started at the Washington Post full-time as their Supreme Court reporter in 92, but I had covered the Clarence Thomas hearings coming off for Congressional Quarterly Weekly Report. So I'd been watching them closely, and I used to always write about the 5-4 court, but the 5-4 court was not the 5-4 to 6-3 court. And what I've said about the difference between 5-4 and 6-3 is it's not just one more vote. It's the comfort of having one to spare and the comfort of another colleague. And I was often reminded, something I write about in 9 Black Robes is something Justice Scalia has said to me when he was the faculty advisor at the founding of the Federalist Society. He was teaching in Chicago at the time, at the University of Chicago. And he talked about the courage that comes with numbers. That one of the reasons they were thinking about doing the Federalist Society at the time is that know that you have others who think like you do. And that's one thing I've believed with this new conservative majority is that they feel a strength in numbers that has gone beyond just one vote. So that's one thing in terms of substance. And the conservatives of yesteryear, the conservatives of Sandra Day O'Connor and Anthony Kennedy, are not the conservatives of today. There really is not a middle as we thought of it with Lewis Powell and Sandra Day O'Connor and Anthony Kennedy. It's so different. Because remember, those conservative justices, and I did label them conservatives, they voted to uphold Roe in the 1992 Planned Parenthood versus Casey case, and they voted to uphold campus affirmative action in the Grutter case and then the Abigail Fisher case from Texas.
Yeah, so Justice O'Connor was your first biography, which was a fabulous book.
Thank you.
An unbelievably interesting person. You may remember she resigned from the court in 2005 because her husband basically had increasing dementia,
Yeah.
and she wanted to leave quickly so she could still spend time with him when they knew each other. By the time she got off the court a few months later, because she had to wait till her successor was confirmed, Sam Alito, it was already too late. Her husband was already, he was very cheery, and he actually had a boyfriend, which she was happy about because he was happy. But the marriage was a wonderful, wonderful marriage, had really dissipated by that point. And I think she regretted probably in some ways. What would she think of the court today? And I don't mean just the court in terms of being conservative, but the court as being a deliberative body. What would you think she'd think of the justices today? She would tell them.
She would. In fact, oh my God, she was, everyone thinks, when you think of all the subjects I've had, you naturally would think, oh, Justice O'Connor might have been interesting to talk to, and Justice Scalia might have been a tougher case. No, Justice Scalia gave me 12 on-the-record interviews that often I would leave at a certain point because I would be exhausted. Justice O'Connor was like, well, if it isn't my author, and what do you want to know now, and how are your sales? She was so tough, and she had just written The Lazy Bee, and I was like, I'm not cutting into your sales. You don't have to worry about that. But anyway, so Richard, Justice O'Connor and I are at Williamsburg in 2008. She's been off for 3 years, and I was actually interviewing her, and and this is 2008. They hadn't really done a lot of what they had done, but they had started down that path with Samuel Alito. And I said, what do you think of the court? And she said, well, what would you think, Joan? They're dismantling everything. What would you think? So she already was like very strongly worded about that, but she was also someone who really cared about where the country was at. She was, the reason I got interested in her was not so much as first woman on the court, although that was great, but I was interested in her as a politician on the court. She was the first woman elected to a Senate majority in any state house. And so she was really a politician. She came to Washington knowing how to count votes. That was kind of my mantra about her. So to answer your question about what she would think, she'd be like, well, she wanted a code of ethics. She felt like they had to, she was one of the people who really chastised Scalia when he went hunting with Dick Cheney. She wanted them to be worthy of the pedestal that a lot of people put them on.
Yeah, I mean, you should buy and read Joan's current book, but I'd go and read that first one. She's an amazing individual, O'Connor, just absolutely really fascinating. So here's my last question before we go to Q&A, and that is, you wrote most of the book right after October term 2021. You wrote it before. We just had another term before the court. Anything happened this last year which surprised you, given with the Dobbs and the Second Amendment case, all in the July of 2022, June, July 22? Anything happened this past year with the court that we should be thinking about?
Yes, I think what you have now, there are just so many cross currents on this court. Clearly, the chief is trying to obtain some calibration. And I think where we saw it was on the 2 election law cases. The 2 election law cases that they decided had potential to just be an earthquake in politics, to change, to frankly give voice to the Trump forces, really give voice to the Trump forces in 2024, and to really greater encroachment on minority voices under the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And what they did on the Alabama voting rights case that was known as Allen versus Milligan when it came down is they decided not to roll back Section 2, which protects against discrimination in the polls. And the Chief Justice, from his days dating back to the Reagan administration, had really felt that that was a provision of the Voting Rights Act that encroached on states' rights, that had been too broadly interpreted. And both he and Brett Kavanaugh kind of stepped back from the brink on that to say, Alabama, and again, Alabama's arguments were so damn extreme. They were saying that you cannot take race into consideration to try to remedy so many past wrongs and to try to to build a second minority district out of the 7 that Alabama was afforded, when you have a 27% black population in Alabama. So that was one that in hindsight, it looks like, Alabama was just pushing way too hard on that. And the other one that you've heard a couple of us refer to, the independent state legislature theory, that is the idea that state legislatures can control everything about elections without any kind of check from state court judges interpreting state constitutions. Now, the Trump forces really revived this kind of fringe theory from the 2000 Bush v. Gore, and that was one that really had so much potential to upend all sorts of state elections and potentially the 2024 presidential election. But here's something interesting about Justice Amy Coney Barrett. She moved over to the center to form a 6-justice coalition to, first of all, actually do some really fancy footwork on whether they should even decide this case. I have to tell you that North Carolina was still like spinning this case out below, and arguably, as even the Solicitor General of the United States said, this case isn't even like before you anymore. This case doesn't have a final decision. But the justices kind of put on blinders and said, look, it's not an election year. We have an incentive to do this. And so I think the 6 of them decided, look, let's just say that this case can be decided, and let's also send a message to state legislatures that there's a role for state courts. But more importantly, there's kind of a PS on the whole thing saying if state courts ever exceed the bounds of their state constitutions, we, federal judges, and ultimately the Supreme Court can decide what's what.
Yeah, and 2 additional fascinating things. The Biden administration was so convinced, right, that they were going to lose that issue.
Yeah.
The Trump folks were going to win. They tried to get the court to say the case was moot.
Right.
And the court rejected them and ruled in the way they wanted.
Yeah.
The other was that the Chief Justice assigned that opinion to Barrett. She's a very junior justice.
No.
Oh, no,
You're mixing them up. You're thinking the Native American.
Yeah, Native
one.
American.
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
He assigned that one to Barrett, not to Gorsuch.
Yes, I know.
Gorsuch would have loved the Native.
Yeah.
He gave it to Barrett.
You're not going to play nice. I'm just.
So he gave it to someone he's trying to bring over.
Power. Yeah.
He's trying to bring over.
Yeah.
All right, take questions now. People can line up. Yes.
Sam Fleming, I'm curious about whether Justice Roberts is concerned about the ethics and decorum issues that are, circulating in conversations here and all year, and whether behind the scenes he's trying to do something that we may not have heard about.
Well, I can tell you that I've actually done some reporting on that. The chief ages ago was one of the ones who thought, oh, we don't need a formal ethics code. We abide by these. But there have been so many incidents. And he's aware of where public confidence is on the court. So he has been trying to get them to formalize an ethics code. But he wants unanimity. He believes that he needs all 9 on it because, unlike a case that can be 6-3, he can't say, okay, we're all going to abide by these rules. The rest of you can go on private jets. And what he's struggling with right now that I wrote about recently is that there are some holdouts. He might have a majority right now, and I could pretty much bet he does, but there are some holdouts. And one thing Sam Alito certainly expressed recently in that Wall Street Journal interview is just how defiant he is about it. And I suspect that Clarence Thomas, with all these stories that have come out, would be equally defiant. And I do have to say, even though you might be thinking that that Thomas's colleagues are saying, oh, look what Clarence just did, look what Clarence just did. No, they tend to close ranks, and they tend to also think if they go after one of my colleagues, will they go after me? But on this ethics, I can say for certain that the chief is trying to get something behind the scenes. He's just stymied right now. Thank you.
Yes.
Do you have an insider's view that you're willing to share about who the most likely source of the Dobbs leak was?
Oh, my God. I want that. Okay, so the source of the Dobbs leak. As someone who had gotten plenty of leaks in her time, you can imagine the many mixed feelings I had on that evening of May 2nd. I can tell you exactly at 8:32 when it came through and what I was doing. And I knew they had the goods because I knew what it looked like. And I had done reporting, believe it or not, because the Wall Street Journal a week earlier had done something about how There had been 5 votes to reverse. The Wall Street Journal editorial page, which has been very much leaked to by conservative justices, had done a story about the conservatives and where they were, and Roberts tried to pick off votes. So I had done some reporting that told me that yes, they have 5 votes. Alito has the opinion. So I knew so much about it was real. I actually do not know anything about how they got it. I suspect it changed hands. People keep saying, oh my God, wasn't it like Ginny Thomas? Wasn't it Martha Ann Alito? Wasn't it the so-and-so? And I feel like those people are all still so institutionalist when it comes to those things that they wouldn't have. And I also think the clerks are so scared that they wouldn't have. But that doesn't say, there were so many copies of it floating around that I could have seen somebody bringing it home and then someone in the apartment or someone else knowing that the value and then it making its way to Politico. The other strange thing was that it was Politico. I have to say, I have gotten leaks. NPR has gotten leaks. The Times is a much bigger entity that if you were being super strategic, you might have gone to a different publication. But I do salute Politico for the way they did vet it to make sure it was real and how they handled it.
One thing I'll add, it's really interesting. The court issued its reports this past year after the investigation, and the wording of the court and the wording of Michael Chertoff was exactly the same, and it said, we've not been able to identify, comma, on a preponderance of evidence standard, comma. So that told me they think they know who did it.
They do. There are, especially
because they could easily have said, well, we don't need preponderance of evidence standard. That's more likely than not. We have a reasonable suspicion. We have probable cause. I think they're pretty sure they know who it was. And I think they decided, and this is interesting to me, they decided it would not be responsible for them to name that name unless they knew by at least preponderance of the evidence standard, because that person's life was going to be shattered. And so I think they decided internally what the standard was. Wasn't reasonable suspicion, wasn't probable cause. There's no criminal violation here. It was preponderance of the evidence, and they didn't reach that. But I think they all have, which then Alito then later said, I know who it is, because he couldn't keep his mouth shut. But I think they know, but they don't think they have enough evidence to say it publicly. Yes.
Hi, Joan. Thank you for being here. When I think of the court, I think a lot about the average American's experience of the court. And what I think of is someone whose head pokes up at the end of June and probably notices the rightward shift in terms of the decisions. And what I'm really curious about, given your experience, is that I think it's fair to infer that the respect amongst the 9 colleagues has eroded over the last little bit here. And so the question I'm thinking about is, why should the average American care that the respect between justices has eroded? What is the impact on that person?
I think that's a really good question. And I would just kind of think about your own lives when you have to work with others. I mean, this is a group of 9 that they can't decide things individually. They have to have consensus. And if you're going to go to the bargaining table, if you're going to go to the conference room, and you're going to be dismissive of a colleague, or you're going to think low of them, you're going to be less willing to have an open mind about maybe moving over a little bit, maybe deciding not to write that concurrence that will further confuse the issue for lower court judges. So I do think that I'm all for them having, sticking to their guns of where they think the law should be. I mean, I think those justices who've been consistent, who've got, who have integrity of their positions, when they're not political, that's important. But to be respectful of colleagues in kind of this, as the chief would say, their common calling. And also, I think that for the time when they were only at 8 justices without Scalia for that year, a lot of them really enjoyed that time because they felt like, look, we have to decide things, or else we were going to be at an impasse of 4-4. And that, some of the justices described that as actually a good time because they had the mantra also of, let's not go too far with a ruling, let's not decide things we don't have to decide. And that kind of philosophy, I think, is sort of helpful to the American public, too. Don't decide cases that you don't need to decide. Don't go too far.
So we have time for one more question.
I guess I'm in line. I have about 15 questions, but I guess they'll be answered by reading your book. So thank you for that opportunity for insight. But one that just jumped to my mind is, if Donald Trump is convicted in January 6th, or perhaps the other cases of 3, can he appeal this all the way to the Supreme Court? And if so, do we have the decision already in place?
Okay, so this is interesting. Donald Trump has already said, I'm going to have the Supreme Court intervene. Well, they can only intervene, obviously, if there's some legal issue along the way that, to bring up, perhaps on the venue question, who knows? But look at where the court was at, even with the 3 Trump appointees, as we were ending the 2020 cycle. They really did not want to be part of this. They did not want to be part of that. And I believe, first of all, if there is a conviction of Donald Trump, I think that whatever, he will try to appeal it up to the Supreme Court. The lower court judges in great measure have been conscientious about this. So there might be enough rulings below that stop him from appealing. And again, we don't know what's going to happen, that try to stop him in his tracks. But I don't think we have a Supreme Court that is inclined as a majority to favor Donald Trump in this kind of situation. But, with all the caveats that even Jack Smith said when he brought the indictment, everyone is innocent until proven guilty, and, we will see how this plays out. But we're now in for that ride, aren't we?
Joan, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Debbie. Thank you, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. And follow Joan